Cold Reckoning presents. My parents cut me off, then asked for help. The last thing my mother said to me before she hung up the phone was this: "You are a disappointment, and until you come to your senses, you are not our daughter." I was 26 years old. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended. The line was dead, the apartment was silent, and I just stood there, receiver in hand, staring at the wall. And then I did something that surprised even me. I didn't cry. I put the phone down, poured myself a glass of water, and went back to work. Because somewhere deep in my chest, underneath all the pain, underneath 26 years of trying, was something that felt dangerously close to relief. And that feeling scared me more than anything they had ever said. You need to understand who my parents were to understand what that moment really meant. My father built his entire identity around appearances, what the family looked like from the outside, what the neighbors thought, what the church thought, what everyone at the dinner parties and the school meetings and the Sunday services thought. What we actually felt inside the house, that was never part of the conversation. My mother backed him up in everything, every rule, every decision, every silence. She called it loyalty to the family. I called it something else, but I learned early on not to say it out loud. Growing up, love in my house was conditional. Get the right grades, you were celebrated. Choose the right friends, you belonged. Question the wrong thing, you disappeared, not physically. But in every way that mattered, you became invisible, like you were furniture they'd stopped noticing. I learned very early that the safest version of me was the quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who smiled at dinner, who got the awards, who never told the truth about what she actually wanted. I played that role for 26 years. I was very, very good at it. Until the day I wasn't. What finally broke the silence was a job offer. Not just any offer, the kind you spend years working toward. A position at a company I respected in a city 3,000 miles away. Real responsibility, real growth, real money, real life. When I told my parents over dinner, I was nervous, but I was also proud. I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is finally something they'll celebrate without conditions attached. My father set down his fork. He looked at me across the table, the same look he'd given me every time I'd ever done something outside his script, and he said, "You're abandoning this family. Not congratulations, not we'll miss you, not even tell us more." Just that, flat, final, like a verdict. I tried to explain. I told them this wasn't abandonment, this was my future, my one real shot. I told them I could visit. I told them we could call every week. I told them I loved them and that none of this changed that. My mother looked at her plate. My father shook his head slowly, the way he always did when he'd already decided the conversation was over. Then he said the thing I think had been waiting inside him for years, maybe my whole life. "We didn't raise you to put yourself first." The table went quiet, and I heard myself say, quietly, without anger, almost like a question, maybe that was the problem. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Then my mother picked up her phone, walked into the hallway, and called me from the next room. I answered. And that's when she said it. "You are a disappointment, and until you come to your senses, you are not our daughter." The call ended, and I stood there, alone in their kitchen, with the sound of them watching television in the other room. I picked up my bag, I walked to the door, I said nothing. And I left. Here's what nobody tells you about being cut off by your own parents. It doesn't just hurt. It disorients you. Because the people who were supposed to be your foundation, the ones whose voices you heard before you could even form words, just pulled the ground out from under you. And for a while, I'm not going to lie to you, I fell. The first weeks were the hardest. I questioned everything, every choice I'd made, every boundary I'd tried to hold, every time I'd chosen my own truth over their approval. I wondered if they were right about me. I wondered if selfish was just the word people use for someone who finally stopped sacrificing themselves. I wondered if somewhere along the way, I had broken something that could never be repaired. I stayed in that dark place longer than I'd like to admit. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. When there's truly nothing left to lose, you finally find out who you actually are. And what I found, underneath all the conditioning and the fear and the desperate need to be enough for people who kept moving the goalposts, was someone I actually liked. If you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family, like no matter what you did or how hard you tried, you were always one wrong move away from losing their love, hit subscribe right now. Cold Reckoning is built for people who are done shrinking themselves to fit into spaces that were never made for them. New stories every week. Share this one with someone who needs it today. The first year without them was the strangest year of my life. Strange, not because it was only painful, but because it was also, quietly, the most alive I had ever felt. I took the job. I moved across the country. I arrived in a city where nobody knew my family name, nobody knew the story, nobody had a version of me they needed me to keep playing. I was just a person, starting over, completely alone, and it was terrifying. And it was extraordinary. I made friends who chose me, not because of proximity or obligation, but because they actually wanted to be in the room with me. I found a therapist who helped me understand that what I'd grown up calling normal had a different name. I started doing things simply because they made me happy, not because they would be approved of, not because they looked good, not because they fit the image. I started running at 6 a.m, not to be disciplined, just because I loved the quiet of the streets before the city woke up. I started cooking elaborate meals for one, trying recipes from countries I'd never been to, making a mess of my kitchen and not caring. I started saying what I actually thought, in meetings, in friendships, in every conversation where I used to perform the easier version of myself. I stopped waiting for permission, and slowly, I began to understand something I had never been taught. You do not need the people who hurt you to acknowledge the hurt in order to heal from it. You can grieve the parents you deserved without destroying yourself over the ones you got. You can love someone and still refuse to let them diminish you. It took me a long time to believe that, but I got there. And just when I thought I finally had, the phone rang. It was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, the one person in the family who had always been a little softer, a little more honest, a little more human than the rest of them. She didn't open with pleasantries. She said, "Your father is sick, your mother needs help, I think you should know." I sat with that for a long moment. "How sick?" I asked. She told me. It was serious, the kind of serious that changes everything, the kind that turns proud, immovable people into something smaller and frightened overnight. And then she said the part one hadn't expected. "Your mother wants to call you, she doesn't know how." I thanked my aunt. I told her I'd think about it. And then I sat alone in my apartment for a very long time. Stay with me, because this is the part that matters most. Because the question I had to answer wasn't the one you might think. It wasn't, do they deserve my help? It wasn't, should I forgive them? It wasn't even, will this hurt me? The real question, the one I had to sit with in the silence of my own apartment, with no audience and no one to perform for, was, who do I want to be? Not who did they raise me to be? Not who they needed me to be to make their lives easier. Who did I, after everything, actually want to become? My mother called 3 days later. She didn't apologize right away. That would have been too simple, too clean, too unlike her. She started with small things, how the weather had changed, how the neighborhood looked different. Small talk, the way people do when they don't know how to reach across a distance they created themselves. And then she went quiet, and in that quiet, I heard something I had never heard from her before. She said, "I don't know how to do this." 4 words, but in our family, in the language we'd spoken my entire life, where vulnerability was weakness and admitting fault was surrender, those 4 words were enormous. I don't know how to do this. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it sit, and then I said, "I know, Mom, me neither." We didn't fix everything on that call. We didn't fix it in the next one or the one after that. But something cracked open, just slightly, just enough. I started flying home twice a year. Not to return to who I used to be, I was never going back to that, but to show up as the person I had become on my own terms, with my own boundaries clearly in place. My father never said the word sorry. Some people never do. But he started asking me questions, real ones, about my work, about my life, in a way he never had before. And I understood that for a man like him, that was as close to an apology as I was ever going to get. And I decided that was enough. Not because he earned it, but because carrying the weight of waiting for a perfect apology was costing me more than letting it go. I helped them, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, not because they deserved it. I helped them because I chose to. Because the woman I had built myself into, through 3 years of silence and distance and growth, was someone who could hold her own hurt in one hand and still extend the other. And that felt like the most powerful thing I had ever done. Not the job, not the move, not surviving the cutoff. The choice to help anyway, freely, without losing myself, that was the victory. This is not a story about forgiving people who never asked for it. It's not a story about pretending the wounds aren't real. It's a story about something much harder than either of those things. It's about choosing who you become when the people who shaped you weren't who they should have been. It's about building your identity not out of rebellion, not out of bitterness, but out of the quiet daily decision to be someone you are actually proud of. My parents cut me off and called it love. I walked away and called it survival. And when the call finally came, I answered it and called it choice. The difference between those three things is the whole story of my life. And maybe in some way it's part of yours too. If it is, share this video right now. Someone in your life is carrying this exact weight and they need to hear that they are not alone. Subscribe to Cold Reckoning. Every story on this channel is for the ones who were told they were too much and decided to become exactly that. We'll see you in the next one.